Nothing about the demolition site suggested trouble. The workers treated the job like any other contracted teardown in a quiet Massachusetts suburb, Longwood, a place where nothing extraordinary had ever happened, at least not publicly. They moved fast, crushing twisted metal beams against the concrete shell of the old parochial school that had stood vacant since early 2023. Dust drifted through the morning air. Radios buzzed. Engines hummed. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. When the hydraulic press struck the wall beneath the abandoned gymnasium with unexpected force, the echo felt wrong, hollow, distant, like striking an empty ribcage. A second blow made the whole crew pause. Someone cut the engine. The air turned unnaturally still, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Beneath the fractured slabs of concrete, something metallic glimmered. A steel door, buried in the foundation, its edges rusted and its lock older than any living worker on site. At first, the crew assumed it was an old maintenance room, sealed sometime in the 1970s. But the door was unusually heavy, reinforced from the inside. When a manager arrived and ordered it opened, they discovered that no standard tool could pry it loose. Only a rotary saw and bolt cutters finally weakened the hinges enough for the slab of metal to fall backward with a resonant clang. A dark stairwell yawned beneath them. The men hesitated. One clicked on his flashlight and descended. The others followed, but only a few steps down. The beam of light froze them mid-stride. The room below wasn't a storage cellar. It wasn't an old boiler room. It wasn't anything they expected to see under a school operated for decades by the Holy Cross Parish. There were 3 iron beds, positioned perfectly parallel, each with welded chain anchors at all 4 corners. Steel shackles lay coiled on the floor like serpents. And on each bed, neatly folded, heavy wool blankets embroidered with names: Claire Hanley, Sophie Brooks, Isabel Martin. Names Longwood hadn't spoken aloud in nearly 30 years. One of the men stepped closer, running his trembling fingers across the faded stitching. Beneath one blanket lay a childish notebook with no cover, its pages blank, except for faint indentations where a pencil had once pressed too hard. Another flashlight traced the far wall, then froze. Painted in frantic, overlapping strokes of black. We were too loud for the silence they wanted. Below the words, dozens of small fingerprints, smeared in uneven streaks, trailing down the wall. The foreman backed up the stairs at once, breath shaking, and called the police. By noon, the site was sealed. Helicopters thudded overhead. Neighbors gathered behind barricades, whispering the names they had not dared to say in decades. Claire, Sophie, Isabel, 3 14-year-old girls who vanished from St. Augustine Academy in the summer of 1993. The case that tore the town apart. The case the church insisted had been resolved. The case parents were told to let go. But the truth had always been buried deeper than anyone imagined. Literally. What no one on the demolition crew knew, not yet, was that the story of the 3 missing girls had been whispered for years in Longwood's diners, backyards, and late-night conversations. People had suspicions. People had doubts. But the church had paperwork, the courts had technicalities, and time had the power to quiet almost anything. Until a steel door beneath an old gym cracked the silence open again. That afternoon, detectives entered the room. Their footsteps echoed off peeling walls, scattering dust that had not been disturbed in decades. On the floor, they found pencils broken in half. A small wooden rosary. A hair ribbon gone brittle with age. None of it made sense, not the condition of the items, not the absence of bodies, not the impressions on the beds where weight seemed once to have lain. And then the diaries surfaced. Hidden behind a false layer of wallpaper, stacked tightly as if someone had pressed them there in a hurry. Pages written in 3 different hands. Pages that trembled even before anyone touched them. Pages telling stories no investigator, no parent, no priest had ever admitted existed. Stories about whispering halls. About late-night footsteps where no one should have been walking. About a cold presence descending from the old chapel after sundown. About the girls being told to practice silence, or else. Stories that ended abruptly 3 days before the girls vanished. Longwood had waited 30 years for answers. Now the answers were clawing their way back into the light. And nothing about what was coming next would leave the town untouched. In the summer of 1993, St. Augustine Academy stood quietly at the edge of Longwood, nestled between oak trees and a narrow two-lane road that led straight out to the highway. It was the kind of parochial school many American parents trusted without question: uniforms, morning prayers, strict discipline, no nonsense. A place where rules shaped young minds, and silence was considered a virtue. To the girls who attended it, the days felt predictable. Bells rang on the hour. Nuns kept watch from the hallways. Priests strolled the grounds with measured steps, hands folded behind their backs. Nothing outwardly strange ever happened. Which made the disappearance of 3 honor roll students, Claire Hanley, Sophie Brooks, and Isabel Martin, feel impossible. Back then, the school wasn't abandoned. It was alive with chatter, the rustle of worksheets, the sharp scent of floor polish, and sunlight streaking through stained glass windows. Teachers graded papers during lunch breaks. Students planned summer camps and volunteer projects. Life was normal. Or at least, it pretended to be. Claire, Sophie, and Isabel came from different states, but each of their families chose St. Augustine for the same reason: safety and structure. Claire's mother moved them from Pittsburgh after a messy divorce. Sophie's parents, devout and conservative, hoped the academy would give their daughter moral grounding. Isabel, the dreamer of the trio, came from outside Chicago to be closer to her older brother, who attended a nearby technical college. The 3 girls met in 7th grade and became inseparable almost instantly, 3 quiet personalities who understood each other without having to speak. They spent afternoons doing homework under the maple trees, trading secrets over peanut butter sandwiches, and practicing piano in the music hall until a nun flicked the lights to shoo them out. But in the last weeks of the semester, the mood at the school shifted. First, the girls whispered about voices in the hall at night, soft, rhythmic, like someone chanting behind the old chapel doors. Then they noticed food disappearing from the kitchen pantry and water jugs turning up half-empty in the mornings. Teachers blamed rats. Janitors blamed faulty locks. But the girls insisted something, or someone, was creeping through the building after dark. One Friday in June, during biology class, their teacher Sister Ellen called roll. When she reached the names of the 3 girls and heard no answer, she simply paused, frowned, and moved on. It wasn't until hours later, when they failed to show up for chapel service, that anyone realized something was wrong. Claire's textbooks were still open on her desk. Sophie's half-written letter to her parents lay tucked under her notebook. Isabel's music sheets had been spread across the piano bench as if she intended to return in minutes. The bell rang. Students shuffled to their lockers. Teachers straightened out papers. But the 3 girls never walked through the doors again. By 5 p.m., when parents arrived to pick up their children, panic had already begun to bloom beneath the calm reassurance of administrators. "We sent them home earlier," the staff insisted. "They were dismissed for disciplinary reasons." It didn't make sense. These girls had spotless records. When parents confronted the teachers, no one could confirm who signed the dismissal slips. Some claimed the girls were disruptive. Others claimed they were disrespectful during morning mass. But every story contradicted the next. By sundown, the school office faxed a set of documents to the police, records claiming Claire, Sophie, and Isabel had been expelled 2 weeks earlier. Only one problem. All 3 families had spoken to their daughters the night before. None had mentioned anything about expulsion. The investigation started immediately. Longwood wasn't the sort of place where children went missing unnoticed. Police searched classrooms, closets, crawl spaces, boiler rooms, and the storm tunnels beneath the playground. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no strange tire marks by the road. The security cameras outside, installed just months before, recorded nothing unusual. Inside the building, cameras didn't exist. Detectives questioned faculty members. Every nun, every priest, every maintenance worker. Most said they saw nothing. A few admitted hearing soft crying near the basement doors that afternoon. Sister Margaret, the disciplinarian in charge, dismissed the claim entirely. "If there had been crying," she said coolly, "I would have known." Meanwhile, the parents grew desperate. The press arrived. Rumors spread. Some whispered about cult activity. Others about a rogue staff member. But the story that haunted the town most was the one no one could prove. That the girls never left the school. 1 week after the disappearance, the academy submitted paperwork for an emergency interior renovation, stamped and signed by Father Benedict and Sister Margaret. The funds were spent within 3 days. No renovation ever took place. At the later hearing, the judge reprimanded the school for falsifying records and obstructing the investigation. But without physical evidence, without bodies, without any proof of what happened behind those stone walls, the charges amounted to nothing more than fines. The case went cold. The academy remained open. Students returned to class. Parents tried to move on. The girls' bedrooms at home stayed untouched, waiting for children who would never step inside again. Longwood learned to live with a silence that felt heavier than grief. And beneath the gymnasium, beneath decades of cement and prayer and polished floors, the truth waited patiently, breathing in the dark. 30 years later, when the demolition crew uncovered the steel door, old wounds split open like fresh ones. Not even the parents, now older, slower, worn down by decades of unanswered questions, knew what awaited them underground. But when the police summoned them to identify what was found, each mother felt it in her bones before she even stepped inside. Whatever happened in 1993 didn't happen above ground. It happened down there. Out of sight. Out of reach. Out of mercy. And the story was far from finished. For 3 decades, the story of the missing girls had been patched over with rumors and half-truths, sealed behind legal jargon and church statements that always seemed rehearsed. Longwood learned to walk past the old academy without looking at it too long, as if silence kept the past from waking. Parents warned their kids not to play near the fenced grounds. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside at night. But no one imagined that the building itself still held evidence of the truth. Until the diaries appeared. It happened the day after investigators stepped into the secret basement room. A forensic team peeled away warped wallpaper in the hallway outside the stairwell. Beneath it, behind a sheet of plaster that crumbled under light pressure, they found a hollow space. Too small for a person, too perfectly cut to be accidental. Inside was a stack of notebooks, their covers worn and edges curled like they had absorbed every tear shed over them. Claire's writing was jagged, emotional. Sophie's was neat, almost painfully precise. Isabel's was round, musical, the handwriting of a girl who hummed when she worked. At first, detectives treated the diaries as personal reflections, teenage concerns, prayers, gossip. But the deeper they read, the clearer it became that the girls had been documenting something they feared long before they vanished. The earliest entries were harmless. "We practiced piano today. Sister Ellen says we're improving. We laughed so much at lunch Sophie nearly choked on her juice. The chapel bells were pretty today. It felt warm." Then the tone changed. "Someone walked past our room last night. It sounded like metal dragging on the floor. The pantry door was open again this morning. I swear I closed it. They told us we can't talk in the hallways anymore. Why? We're not babies." A week later, another shift. Isabel says she heard crying coming from near the basement. But Sister Margaret says the basement is locked. Father Benedict looked at us strangely today. Not angry. Just quiet. I think someone took Sophie's rosary. She won't admit she's scared, but I can tell. And then? They keep telling us to be quiet. Quiet in the chapel. Quiet in the dorms. Quiet at meals. Claire whispered that someone gets angry when we talk too much. I don't know who she means. By the time detectives reached the entries dated 3 days before the disappearance, 9 officers had gathered in the room in complete silence. The handwriting trembled. Lines slanted, ink smudged as if the pages were written in a hurry, or in tears. There was music tonight under the floors. Not from the chapel. A low humming, like an organ played in the wrong key. Someone scratched marks on the hallway walls. Sophie says they weren't there before dinner. We saw a man by the basement door. Tall, in a dark coat. Not a priest we know. He didn't speak. Just watched us walk by. The final entries felt like confessions written under duress. We heard footsteps outside our dorm room after midnight. Isabel thinks someone is trying to punish us. For what? For laughing too much? We tried to pray, but the lights flickered and Sophie started crying and Claire wouldn't open her eyes. And then the last coherent page, Claire's handwriting. If anyone finds this, please tell them we didn't run away. They took us downstairs. They said we were too loud. Too loud for the silence they wanted. The next page was torn. The one after that was blank. The rest were soaked from age, unreadable. Investigators froze. Even the most seasoned officers, the ones who had seen every kind of cruelty humans could inflict, stared at the words with something close to disbelief. These weren't the diaries of girls imagining monsters. These were children documenting the days leading up to their own disappearance. The parents were called in to review the findings. They drove from across the country, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, moving slower than they used to, carrying the kind of sorrow that permanently bends the spine. Claire's mother was the first to touch the diary. She pressed her thumb to the smudged ink like she expected her daughter's warmth to still be there. Sophie's father traced the indentation marks where his daughter had pressed the pen too hard, the way she always did when she was nervous. Isabel's brother, now in his 40s, read the pages silently and then stepped outside, leaning against the railing as if the world had tilted and might throw him off. The investigators gave them space. But everyone in the room knew. The diaries were evidence. They were warnings. They were pleas. And they were proof that the Academy had lied from the beginning. That night, word spread across Longwood faster than any news station could broadcast it. People gathered outside the demolition site with candles. Some prayed. Some demanded justice. Somewhat for girls they hadn't thought about in 20 years, but suddenly remembered as if the disappearance had happened yesterday. Former students came forward, anonymously at first, then openly. They spoke of teachers who avoided certain hallways at night. Of priests who carried heavy keys on chains. Of rumors about a basement that wasn't on the school blueprint. Of nights when whispers floated through the dorms, telling them not to speak. One woman, now in her 30s, admitted, "I used to hear singing under the chapel floor. Low and slow. Like someone playing an organ in the basement. But they told us we were imagining it." Another said, "I saw Sophie the day before she vanished. She looked scared. I asked what happened. She just said we talk too much. They don't like that. And then Sister Margaret called her away." Police filed every statement, though most came decades too late to become admissible evidence. Still, a pattern emerged, small shadows forming the outline of a much darker shape. 2 days later, crime scene analysts discovered something else. The diaries weren't the only thing hidden. Beneath the floorboards of the girls' old dormitory, tucked between beams, were tiny fabric scraps, pieces of the same blankets found on the beds in the secret room. The fabric hadn't aged naturally. It had torn under pressure. As if something, or someone, had tried to rip it away. When the lead detective briefed the task force, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every officer in the room already felt the weight of the case crushing down. "Whatever happened to those girls," he said quietly, "did not happen by accident. And it didn't happen quickly. Someone planned this. Someone executed it. And someone kept it hidden for 30 years. A silence followed so deep it felt almost reverent. The town's nightmare had returned, not as a ghost story but as a crime with physical evidence, handwritten fear, and names sewn into blankets that should never have existed. And now the question everyone feared most resurfaced. Where were the girls? Not symbolically. Not spiritually. Physically. If they had died in that room, where were their bodies? If they were moved, who moved them? And if someone had been watching those diaries crumble behind wallpaper for all these years, who else still knew the truth? Inside was a cassette tape. The label read, Chapel Night Rehearsal, June 11th. The date was 2 days before the girls vanished. Detectives brought the tape to the lab and played it on an old machine. Static. Then faint, distant organ notes. And beneath it, a girl's voice. Soft. Trembling. Is someone down there? A second voice whispered. Don't talk. They said no talking. Then, a scraping sound. A low, heavy breath. A muffled cry. Footsteps. The tape cut off abruptly. Everyone in the room stared at the machine, the hairs on their arms rising. It wasn't proof of what happened. But it was proof of fear. Proof of presence. Proof of something, or someone, who should not have been there. By the end of the week, detectives were exhausted, the town was restless, and the church was cornered. The missing girls were no longer just a cold case. They were a wound ripping open, spilling secrets no one was prepared to confront. The families gave a joint statement on national television. Claire's mother spoke first, holding the diary close to her chest. They told us our daughters walked away, she said. They lied. Sophie's father added. Someone knew what happened. And they hid it. Isabel's brother said nothing. He just stared into the camera with eyes full of fire. The anchor ended the segment with the line that trended across the country that night. If silence protected someone for 30 years, it's time to find out who. But underneath Longwood's rising fury lingered one question that terrified investigators more than any other. If someone hid the truth for 3 decades, what else were they still hiding? The reopening of the investigation hit Longwood like a summer storm, sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. Reporters camped near the police barricades. Satellite trucks lined the street. People who had buried the past under layers of resignation now felt something they hadn't felt in decades. Hope, fear, and anger sharpened into something almost electric. But the ones who felt the pressure most were those who had worked at St. Augustine Academy in 1993, those who had stayed silent. Detectives began tracking down the faculty members who were still alive. Some lived nearby, aging quietly in Longwood's outskirts. Others had moved to retirement homes in Florida or New Hampshire. A few refused to answer the door. A handful had already passed away. The first person investigators questioned was Sister Margaret Pierce, once the disciplinarian feared by generations of students. Back then, she walked through the halls with a ruler in hand and a stare that could cut through excuses like a blade. In 2023, she lived alone in a small house owned by the parish, its paint chipped, its gutters sagging. She opened the door only after detectives threatened to return with a warrant. Sister Margaret had aged, but her eyes, cold and razor-sharp, remained unchanged. We have questions about the girls, the lead detective said gently. I answered those questions 30 years ago, she replied without emotion. You didn't answer truthfully. Something flickered across her face, annoyance, not guilt. I followed the procedures I was given. What procedures? The detective pressed. For a moment, her facade cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but enough. Ask the church? She muttered. Ask the ones who wrote the rules. We only enforced them. Then she closed the door. Her refusal was expected, but it confirmed something investigators had suspected. Sister Margaret had never acted alone. The next visit was to Father Thomas Weller, now in his 70s and recovering from a hip replacement. He welcomed detectives into his home with an odd mix of hospitality and dread, as if he expected this day to arrive and had rehearsed his mistakes in the mirror. He insisted he knew nothing. He insisted he never saw the girls leave campus. He insisted the basement had been sealed off since the 1960s, long before he arrived. But something about his voice, tight, trembling at the edges, betrayed him. When detectives showed him a photo of the iron beds, he looked away. When they showed him the embroidered names, he made the sign of the cross. And when they showed him the message on the wall, "We were too loud for the silence they wanted," he began to cry. Please, he whispered. I can't speak of that time. I can't. He didn't admit guilt. He didn't deny involvement. He simply collapsed under the weight of a secret that had survived longer than the school itself. But the most chilling interview came from a former janitor, Elliot Marsh, who had been 22 in 1993 and worked the night shift. He lived alone now, in a trailer at the edge of town, surrounded by rusting bicycles and broken lawnmowers. When investigators approached him, he didn't resist. "I knew you'd come," he said, as if greeting an overdue visitor. "What do you remember about that summer?" the detective asked. Elliot scratched his beard slowly, eyes unfocused. "The girls were good kids," he said. "Always thanked me for fixing things. They didn't deserve what happened." "What did happen?" He stared past the detectives, toward the trees behind his trailer. "There were nights I heard things downstairs," he murmured. "Didn't sound like pipes or rats. Sounded like praying. Crying sometimes. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Why didn't you report it?" "I tried. Sister Margaret told me the basement was off limits. Said if I kept asking about it, I'd lose my job." He paused, struggling to breathe. "One night," he said, "the girls came to me. Claire asked if there was another way out of the building. I told her I didn't know. Isabel kept glancing over her shoulder, like someone was watching. Sophie said they were being punished for talking too much." The detective swallowed hard. "What did you do?" "What could I do? They were kids. And I was nobody." His voice cracked. "I should have helped them." The investigators left with more questions than answers. But a picture began forming, one darker and clearer than the town had ever imagined. Someone at the academy had enforced silence with brutality. Someone had access to the basement. Someone had taken advantage of the school's isolation and authority to hide whatever horrors occurred underground. And someone higher up, maybe several, had protected them. The church's official spokesperson released a statement 2 days later, offering condolences but denying responsibility. The statement infuriated the town. Within hours, a crowd gathered outside St. Helena's Parish, demanding the records be opened, the remaining clergy questioned, the truth finally exposed. Protesters held candles, signs, even old photographs of the 3 girls. Parents of former students cried in one another's arms. No one remembered Longwood ever being this loud. Inside the church, the priests watched from behind locked doors. Meanwhile, in the temporary evidence lab, analysts studied the objects found in the basement room. The chains were old but not ancient, manufactured sometime between 1985 and 1990. The wool blankets, custom made. The stitching on the names? Done with deliberate care. Almost tender. One analyst whispered to another. Someone wanted them to be remembered. But another object caught everyone's attention, a small metal vessel found wedged between the wall and one of the bed frames. It resembled a censer, the kind used in Catholic Mass to burn incense, but darker, heavier, coated in something that wasn't soot. Forensic testing identified traces of resin and an unknown powder. Nothing toxic. Nothing illegal. But nothing typical of church incense either. What ritual had required it? Who performed it? And why were 3 terrified girls involved? The next breakthrough came from an unexpected place, an attic in the home of a retired music teacher, Mrs. Callahan, who had taught piano at St. Augustine. Her memory had faltered in recent years, but when her daughter mentioned the reopened investigation, she insisted that detectives search her attic. There, under old sheet music and dusty hymnals, they found a cardboard box labeled 1993, not to keep. In late autumn, Longwood's landscape changed. Leaves fell from the maples around the demolished academy grounds, revealing bare branches like bones raised toward the gray sky. Cold wind rattled the temporary fences, lifting dust from the crater where the gym had once stood. And yet crowds still gathered every evening, parents, former students, reporters, people who barely remembered the case but felt its gravity now like a stone in their chest. Everyone was waiting. Waiting for the commission's final report. Waiting for answers. Waiting for justice that had taken 30 years to even begin moving. Inside a converted conference hall at the town center, investigators pored over documents, tapes, fabric samples, fingerprints, handwriting analysis. The pausing of public life around Longwood felt surreal. Grocery lines, coffee shops, sidewalks, all buzzing with theories. But behind closed doors, the truth finally began to take shape. It started with a discovery made by an archivist named Miriam Jacobs, who had been painstakingly reviewing old diocesan financial records stored off-site. She didn't expect to find anything relevant. Most records were account ledgers, maintenance requests, payroll forms. Then she noticed something. In July 1993, 3 weeks after the girls vanished, the parish had approved a large emergency purchase of cement, steel rods, and foundation-grade bolts. Not for repairs. Not for renovations. For structural reinforcement of subterranean space. A space that had never appeared on any official blueprint. A space that, according to handwritten notes in the margin, had to be sealed immediately. The request was signed by Father Benedict, and countersigned by a man whose name no one recognized. Father Callum Brunn. There were no employment records for him. No assignment logs. No ordination papers. Yet his signature appeared on several memos between 1991 and 1994, each referencing the basement, each citing disciplinary containment. Miriam brought the files to the task force. Within hours, the room exploded in tension. Why was this never disclosed? Where did this priest come from? And how many people approved this without looking? The deeper they dug, the stranger it became. Father Brunn had no digital footprint. No obituary. No parish listings. It was as if he had stepped out of thin air, lived behind the chapel walls, and disappeared again. One detective murmured, "You know what's worse? It means someone gave him authority here." That same afternoon, ground-penetrating radar teams scanned the area around the old building. For weeks they had found nothing, no remains, no tunnels, no mass graves. But this time, near the far corner of the collapsed foundation, the scanner signaled a void. A man-made cavity. Rectangular. Reinforced. Sealed. The entire crew froze. Even the wind seemed to pause as investigators ordered the soil excavated. Bulldozers carved into the earth. Work lights snapped on. The smell of damp dirt rose around them. After nearly 3 hours of digging, a heavy cement slab emerged, exactly the dimensions of a burial vault. But when they cracked it open, it wasn't a grave. It was a corridor. A tunnel running beneath the academy grounds, leading somewhere beneath the old chapel. The air inside was stale, carrying the cold smell of abandoned stone and something older, fear, maybe, preserved in the walls. Investigators stepped carefully, flashlights sweeping across narrow passageways. Metal brackets jutted out like ribs. Faded chalk marks lined the stone. At one point, a rusted lantern hung from a hook, as if someone had meant to return. But the worst part came at the end of the corridor. A locked wooden door, bolted from the outside. When they forced it open, the room beyond was small, circular, no more than 10 feet across. Candle wax coated the floor. The walls were covered in symbols, some Christian, some not. On a pedestal lay a half-burned notebook. The name inside, Isabel Martin. The final pages were charred, but some words survived. "They brought us here again. They said we broke the silence." Sophie is shaking. Claire tried to speak, but they slapped her. "They keep saying the noise wakes something. Something that isn't God." Investigators stopped reading. Not because they were done, but because they couldn't breathe. That night, the town gathered again outside the fenced demolition site. The wind was sharp, winter finally arriving. Parents held each other. Reporters whispered to their microphones. The families of the girls stood silently near the front, as if bracing for a blow they already knew was coming. At 8:15 p.m., the lead detective stepped before the crowd. His face was pale under the floodlights. "We have located additional subterranean structures beneath the academy," he began. "And we have found evidence that the girls were taken there after they disappeared." Murmurs sliced through the cold air. "We do not yet have confirmation of human remains," he continued carefully. But the evidence strongly suggests that the girls were held in multiple underground locations. Claire's mother closed her eyes. Sophie's father clenched a fist. Isabel's brother stared straight ahead, lips trembling. And there is more, the detective said. There was a coordinated effort to conceal these spaces, to erase records, to silence witnesses, to mislead the investigation. Not negligence, not confusion. A cover-up. Decades long. Systemic. Deliberate. The crowd erupted, some shouting in anger, some breaking down in tears, some simply standing motionless as if their minds could not contain the weight of it. But the families already knew. They had known for years. They just needed the world to know too. In the weeks that followed, federal agents joined the investigation. Every hidden corridor was mapped, every stone analyzed. Dogs searched the grounds daily, trained to detect remains even decades old. But despite the evidence of confinement, despite the symbols, diaries, tunnels, and testimonies, one truth continued to evade them. The girls' bodies were never found. Instead, investigators found scraps of clothing, hair fibers, more candle wax, and what appeared to be fragments of wooden rosaries, broken violently. The absence of bodies was almost worse than discovering them. It meant the final chapter of the girls' lives remained unwritten. It meant someone had moved them, or destroyed the evidence, or buried them somewhere still hidden. When reporters pressed the task force for a definitive answer, the spokesperson replied, "We cannot confirm their final location, but we can confirm they never left these grounds alive." Those words became the headline across the country. 1 month later, the commission released its final report, over 900 pages long. It named church officials who falsified documents. It identified at least 3 individuals who likely knew about the basement's existence. It referenced Father Callum Brunn repeatedly, though his identity was never verified. It concluded that the Academy leadership in 1993 knowingly concealed the deaths of Claire Hanley, Sophie Brooks, and Isabel Martin. It concluded that silence had been weaponized. It concluded that the girls had been punished for reasons that made no moral sense, only institutional ones. But the most haunting line appeared on the last page. They cried out, but no one answered. Their silence was enforced, not chosen. On the anniversary of their disappearance, the town erected a memorial on the old academy grounds. 3 pillars of smooth stone, each engraved with a name. People placed candles at their bases, despite the wind that kept blowing them out. That evening, Claire's mother stepped forward to speak, her voice unsteady but strong. "They wanted silence," she said. "But we will not give it to them," Sophie's father added. "They thought time would bury the truth. They were wrong," Isabel's brother whispered. "We will say their names. Every year. Forever." The crowd joined in. Claire. Sophie. Isabel. Their voices rose into the cold sky, angry, grieving, unbroken. No one noticed the wind shift through the demolished foundation behind them. No one noticed the faint rattle of a chain disturbed by the breeze. But some later swore they heard it. A soft echo beneath the earth. Not a ghost. Not a myth. Just a memory refusing to stay buried. In Longwood, silence would never again be trusted. Not after the world learned what silence had been hiding.